while we wait, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. I think many of you probably know who I am. It looks like a lot of our clients are on today's call. But I'm Adam Jones. I'm the owner of Firefly MSP, based out of Kansas City. We serve a variety of small businesses, and we define small by basically one to somewhere around 150 employees is a decent target for us. Most of those are in the Kansas City area, but we do have clients kind of throughout the United States. That being said, with our client base, um, we see a lot of the stuff firsthand and wanted to share what we're seeing and what we're not seeing, frankly, and then share some insights as well from other sources that I'll talk about here in a little bit. So it's now 12:02. I'm going to go ahead and hop in. Again, for anybody who's just joined, feel free to use the Q&A section here in Zoom to ask questions. If I see those and they're sort of apropos to what I'm talking about, I will be happy to address them right then. Otherwise, I will circle back to them at the end. But today I wanted to kind of present to everybody the impacts of modern warfare, talk about how the conflicts abroad impact us personally and professionally. So those of you who aren't just intimately aware of this, warfare has moved online, and that's been true for quite a while. That's not necessarily new. The origins of the cyber warfare and the ransomware style attacks actually date all the way back to 1989. When I was researching for this presentation today, that's something I learned. There was a movement. There was this some sort of like a survey diskette that you could get that would take you through a set of questions and then help rate your risk for contracting AIDS, of all things. It came out in 1989, and what would happen is after a certain amount of time, the program would demand money or basically made some threats. So that was the first recorded attack of ransomware, kind of innocuous compared to what we see today. Modern attacks, some of the ones we'll talk about today, those began in large part around 2013. There are some instances of issues before that, but as far as in the public sphere, people being made aware of these things, 2013 was kind of the year that started. The bad actors have traditionally hailed from several locations. Russia has always been high on the list. The government has sort of made it's kind of a wink, wink, nod, nod with the people that lead these things. If they're not officially members of the GRU, which is Russia's equivalent of the CIA, they're often working with the full sort of tacit approval of Russia as long as they don't attack the homeland. We've seen instances in the past where specific attacks were even looking for if someone had Russian language keyboards or Russian language enabled on their computers as an effort to avoid the attack. We were actually hopeful when we discovered that it might be its own kind of protective mechanism, but that has not seemed to be a part of every attack. So there was a time where we thought about just enabling the Russian keyboard to help avoid some of these, but that has not been the case lately. Beyond Russia, North Korea, China, and a lot of Eastern European countries engage in this type of thing. Of course, every country is going to have their own hacking teams and whatnot, but as far as people going after businesses, individuals, infrastructure, those are kind of the big players. I think we would be remiss to not recognize the United States as doing the same thing in return, although I'm not aware of any instance in which the United States targeting in the same way that countries like Russia are. Historically, the goal with a lot of these attacks was to basically just hold your data hostage, hoping that they could either they caught you without backups, or if they didn't catch you without backups, then maybe they caught you in a position where you couldn't restore the backups, or maybe they could encrypt the backups. So their goal was to try to hold your data hostage. You would pay a ransom. It's kind of interesting now because I remember the ransom used to be in Bitcoin. It's always been in Bitcoin, but it used to be one Bitcoin was like $513. Of course, Bitcoin now is like 50,000 per Bitcoin. But the ransoms have gone way up. I would say that what we have seen since then, which we'll deal with here in a little bit, is much more. They've got multi-pronged strategies. So they're not just looking at one strategy to try to hold you hostage in some way, shape, or form. They're looking at multiples. I refer to the U.S. using cyber warfare. A really good example, and I'd recommend you might look this up if you're at all interested in it, because it is honestly fascinating. But the U.S. used a really complicated form of malware to speed up and slow down the turbines and nuclear reactors in Iran on machines that were completely disconnected from the internet. The method in which they accomplished that is quite complicated. I won't get into it here, but I did want to mention it just because it's an interesting instance of the United States doing somewhat similar stuff back to some of these countries. In this case, it was to try to slow down the nuclear program in Iran. You can only imagine that if that's been done there, that there are other attempts on both sides that do similar things, and that's part of what we wanted to cover today. The threats have only grown since the early 2000s. What we're seeing so far this year, I would say really specifically, is relentless attacks against any services that require an open port. Some of our clients use remote desktop protocol for their remote access. It's really important that that not be open to the internet now. It's always been a prime target, but the number of attempts per minute has gone up significantly. Separately, there's two brands listed there, Synology and QNAP. Really specifically, the QNAP devices have been a huge target with some vulnerabilities that were discovered. What these are is network-attached storage devices that a lot of small businesses use, and in some cases, they expose those to the internet to allow for sharing of data with the outside. You need to be really careful with that, and probably consult your IT professional if you're sharing directly to the internet from these devices. Over the past few months, we've been working with some of our clients that had needs to do that on ways to lock that down, whether it be if they're engaging with a specific set of clients, we'll close the ports to only those clients. But I think the big takeaway from this first one is if you have anything that you host inside of the network that is accessible outside of the network, having a conversation about how that might be made more secure this is a good time to do so. And we'll talk about some more specific ways to address these things a little bit later in the presentation. This is not new, but it has only increased in the amount we're seeing. Credential attacks against Microsoft 365, Google Suite, and software as a service in general. I should probably expand this to include Yahoo. It should include AOL. It should include Outlook.com. Any webmail service is going to be a target, and we'll talk about this several times today, but one of my biggest goals to drive home today is to make sure everyone here understands I'm not talking to you just as business owners today. I'm talking to you as individuals as well. And the risks obviously to a business might be greater, but if you're conducting any sort of financial business in your personal life, there's lots of reasons, which I think everybody is. There's lots of reasons that you need to make sure that your personal data hygiene is just as good as your business. So take most of these suggestions today personally and professionally. Phishing and impersonation campaigns, it's been around for a long time. They seem to be getting a little bit better, at least in some cases. I was on a webinar the other day, watching a webinar the other day, and they were discussing the difference between phishing and spear phishing. Phishing generally is, if you know what to look for, you can find it. They might use some weird words. One of the most common ones we see is they'll say truly, which is something I haven't heard individuals include in common language very often, but it's almost always in these phishing attempts. But the spear phishing attempts the phishing's kind of like casting a wide net. Spear phishing is you're going after a single target. And the bottom line of the webinar I was on was if you're spearphished by a professional attacker, say another country's private intelligence service, good luck, because it's going to be incredibly well crafted and hard to detect. So I don't anticipate that anyone on this call is going to be the target of that, but you kind of never know. And the problem is that even if you personally aren't, I think where our concerns head in this conversation is areas that will impact you maybe. And so being prepared is important in lots of different ways. Credential harvesting and reuse from a wide variety of attacks. If you have the same password set in more than one location, and any of those other locations have been compromised, which if you've happened to run a dark web report on yourself, the number of websites that get compromised and have those credentials leaked is massive. You might as well assume that everywhere else you've used that password is going to eventually get hacked. I'm sure you've heard it before that reusing passwords is a bad option, but it has only become worse, and it's only become easier for these attackers to scoop up that information from one hack and then start to spray it against any other account you might have using the same information, and then use that information to break into other services. This is something directed a little bit more at people who administer Office 365 or Google, but making sure that the people that manage businesses are aware of this is equally important. There are sort of apps, I guess you would call them, that you can install into both environments. One of the newer methods for attack is to use, they'll present one of these apps to someone's, the end users of a Office 365 or Google client. Without the special settings set, the default settings would allow that to be approved by basically anyone in the tenant, they call it. Where that's a problem, it may not give them all the access they need to continue to try to attack you, but even if it just gets them access to the directory, which is the list of users, and that's more information that they have, and they can use that to continue their attack, it can be a real problem. What we've done for Firefly clients across the board is disabled the ability to approve those apps without an actual admin approving them. If you manage your own Office 365 or Google, or you have another MSP that's doing that, that's something you should be asking about. We'll talk about, again, the corrective actions here in a little bit, but it's important to get that hole closed. One of the really recent attacks, you may have heard about this one in the news, is compromise of networking gear. WatchGuard devices of a certain age and type were eligible to be really seamlessly hacked and then turned into a kind of botnet of sorts. This was definitely something that was sourced back to, they believe Russia was involved in this. And this was the first time that the FBI admitted, maybe they've done it before, we don't know, but the FBI was proactively using the vulnerability to help patch networks for people who weren't patching them themselves. That's a whole, there could be a whole other discussion about how that works, whether or not that should be possible. In this particular case, I think I'm happy they were patched, I guess is the bottom line. There is obviously a lot of question about the FBI doing that without the express permission of the people who were impacted. But I think the bottom line for people involved in that decision making is the feeling is basically that we're sort of all at war, whether or not we admit it yet. And so some of these tactics require sort of special consideration at the current time. The threats of a more personal nature, and these, it's not really as narrowed down as the title might sound. Critical infrastructure attacks are where I spend most of my time worrying at the moment. At Firefly, we're a member of the FBI InfraGard program. We've been a part of multiple briefings over the past few months since the war in Ukraine began. This is where this is where the worry really centers. The issues that we've described on the previous pages, those things have been kind of ongoing threats that we've talked about. We talked about them last year in a webinar, and we talked about them the year before in a webinar. If you're a client of Firefly, you've probably heard us push pretty hard to put on things like multi-factor authentication, something we'll talk about again here in a little bit. All of that has been kind of normal. What we've seen, though, recently, and what we've been reported to by the FBI, is that the critical infrastructure, they are basically stress testing it. So while we haven't seen a full-scale attack, the various government agencies that watch the cyber realm are seeing a lot of snooping around in these areas. And so what is critical infrastructure? Generally speaking, power, gas, electric, telephone, internet connectivity, medical-related items, hospitals and whatnot, police, fire, EMS. So all of those things are critical infrastructure, and it appears that not only Russia, but other bad actors are really looking around the edges to try to see what's possible there. Where it gets even more terrifying, and this is one of those things where it's you can be aware, but there's so little that you can do on some of these things. It's just planning for what you can, which we'll deal with here in a second. But one of the things that they had said they were identifying recently was malware that can go into industrial control devices. So previously, they would, if there was some sort of device they wanted to try to infect, they would have to work on the computers that maybe controlled that device. What has been happening lately is there's been evidence of actual malware that goes into these devices. So you might have some sort of mechanical control system at any level of infrastructure, and they can actually infiltrate the actual controller that runs it, and that's scary. So I'm thankful, I guess, that the U.S. government has some of these new branches that are helping to address this. But with all of that in mind, it's really important to start to think about if something like this were to happen, How can you prepare for it, and what should you be doing on your own personal and on your business systems? There, in the second point, obviously not just businesses, individuals are targets for all of these things. Personal data systems are being encrypted or manipulated to perpetrate financial fraud. There's a story out of Kansas City from just a few months ago where an individual had bought a house and their Gmail account had been compromised unbeknownst to them for some time. And when the day of closing came, there was a person inside their Gmail account. When the legitimate wire instructions came through, this hacker deleted that email and replaced it with an identical email that had alternate wiring instructions. So it looked legitimate, but it wasn't. And this person wired the entire escrow down payment or the final payment to buy their house to the wrong person, to a criminal. And only once they had moved into the house was everything caught. In their particular case, a GoFundMe campaign in Kansas City locally, I think, helped make them whole. But these are the things that people are, it's not just businesses. You've got to really think about this as protecting yourself, your family, your business, and then educating the future generations about these things as well. Something that definitely plays a role both in business and personal are the Internet of Things devices. That's what IoT means. We haven't seen a wide-scale IoT attack yet, but the concept has been proven over and over. Basically, all of these things that we all have in our houses, whether it be Amazon Alexa or a wireless thermostat or any of the smart technologies, obviously there's a wide array of those. Some are made by reputable manufacturers, some aren't. But the bigger concern is that a lot of them don't receive the regular updates that other computer systems do. So for instance, Google Chrome has a lot of vulnerabilities, especially lately, as does basically everything. But those are addressed pretty proactively by Google. It seems less so with some of these other systems that are sitting in people's houses, whether it be their smart TV or something else. There are updates, but they're few and far between, and there's really not a lot of knowledge to know if they address what could be perceived vulnerabilities in those devices. So one of the things that we've been recommending, I'll get to this on the next slide, so actually I'll just pause there. There is a specific recommendation for this one, but I have it on another slide. Addressing some of these issues is kind of common sense with some of them. If you're hosting, whether it be a Synology NAS and a QNAP NAS like we talked about, remote desktop, or anything else. I mean, there's a lot of reasons you might have something open on your network. By the way, if you don't know if you have things open on your network, that's also something you should be asking your IT professional to help you verify. That's not a bad question to be asking on a regular basis. You know, is my network basically shut down from the internet side? So with any of these, taking a more granular approach is what we'd recommend, I guess, at the top level. First, evaluate if these services need to be open to the internet. If they don't, then we can have a strategy to close that off. We've been using a service like ZeroTier. It's a virtual VPN solution to help mitigate some of these risks. So you load this client on either side. It requires tacit approval to let it work. And it creates a secure end-to-end connection between you and whatever that device is. So a lot of our clients are using remote desktop to access items. They're using ZeroTier to help secure that connection. So that's not the only solution. There are a lot like it, but that's one. With credential attacks, you need to use multi-factor authentication. And this is not just email. Any web application that you personally use or you use for business, I would encourage you all to go look through each one and see if it supports any sort of multi-factor authentication. Most do, but not all. When it's a case where it doesn't support it, if there's no alternative to move to something else that does, making sure you choose a really secure long password, something you probably wouldn't necessarily want to type yourself, is very important. We'll get to how to manage that in point 4 here. But for sure on your email, whether it be personal, business, or otherwise, it needs to have multi-factor authentication. If it does not, your email will get hacked at some point, full stop. It may take longer for an individual to get targeted because there's just less web presence for them to be found. But these attacks are very automated, very sophisticated, and if you've had especially if you've had a reused password, you're going to get hacked. We're not here yet as far as mandating this, but you can start to understand that with a lot of these risks out there, using something like a YubiKey, which I'll explain what that is in just a moment, is really helpful. Basically what YubiKey is it's a physical device, just looks like a USB flash drive, but it plugs into the port on your computer, and and you pair that with, say, your Microsoft 365 account. If that device is not in the USB port of the computer you're accessing your email from, it will not let you access your email. So you can see in a world where we're trying to avoid all these credential attacks that are happening from the website, if you have a physical security key in place, that's going to make it a lot harder for someone that's not here in the United States or at your presence, at your premise. That's going to make it hard for them to attack you. So making sure that you or your IT folks are monitoring failed logins in Office 365 is always helpful. It can be a really strong indicator that there's problems to come. If someone's really pounding on accounts and there's a bunch of failed logins, you're under attack. Now, depending on how you enable MFA there from step 1, you may know that anyway. At least you would know about successful access to your account. One of the nice things on the Microsoft side is if you set up Microsoft Authenticator for your Office 365, which is what we generally recommend people do, if somebody gets past your password, you're going to receive a text message that lets you know, a text message or a push alert, depending on how it's configured, that lets you know it's trying to authenticate. First and foremost, it's really important to not always say yes to those if you're not actually trying to authenticate. But second, if it's not you trying to authenticate and all of a sudden you receive an alert that says someone's logged into your account, do you want to approve it? That tells you that your password has been compromised and it's time to change it. Now, when it comes to passwords, I'm sure that there are people in this call that have spreadsheets that manage that. I'm sure there are some people that use a password manager. I'm sure there are people that are using their web browser to manage it. All of those are, I would not recommend any of those ways to manage passwords, long story short. We at Firefly are personally using 1Password for part of our password management. For anything internal and for my personal items, I use 1Password. It allows you to securely set and share these passwords. So as you set up something like 1Password, you go through and you make every password that you're saving into that system extremely secure. So in our case, we might set a 24, 25 character password. That's just letters, numbers, characters, just basically gibberish. But because we have 1Password loaded on our computers, I have it on my phone, I can autofill those logins so I don't have to type that password. The only password I have to remember is what's called the master password, which of course is something I set uniquely to 1Password. If you're a client of Firefly and that's something you'd like to learn more about, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to talk about it. But using something besides some of those more traditional methods to securely generate, store, and fill these passwords is extremely helpful. I told you I'd have a suggestion earlier for those Internet of Things devices, and here it is. A lot of home routers, when you set them up, and a lot of the routers we set up for our clients include on the Wi-Fi side of things, they include a guest network. Joining these Internet of Things devices to that guest-based network can be really helpful. Now, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, unfortunately, because let's say you're using something like Sonos speakers, which would be an Internet of Things device. Those really need to talk to your local network and to each other so that you can control them. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but for certain things like a lot of times thermostats, televisions, devices where all they really need is an internet connection to work, if you join those to a guest network, they lose the ability to talk to the rest of your network. They can only talk to the internet. And so in a world where we're kind of concerned about those devices being turned against you effectively to use to hack other things on your network, that can be super helpful. So as you set those things up, that's something to consider. I think largely, sort of as we zoom out from that, considering on a case-by-case basis what you actually bring into the house is also good, or what you bring into the business. These things aren't just relegated to people's houses. Considering if the trade-off of security risk is worth the reward is just always something that's probably worth thinking through. There are specific strategies that can be looked at, especially on the business side, to try to address this. But kind of just taking a healthy look at, do I need this? Will the features that it's going to enable be worth the potential risk? And then making decisions from there. When it comes to phishing and impersonation, as we begin renewing our clients into what we call our proactive package, which has evolved over the years, we're in a process of talking with each and every client at Firefly. And one of the things that we're encouraging them to sign up for in our latest package is it includes phishing testing and training. The provider we're using now is a company called Breach Secure Now, and I found it to be quite interesting because some of the messages that they have been sending for testing are good enough that I myself was questioning. I see a lot of these messages, so I feel pretty confident in my ability to know what's real and what's not. And some of these messages have had me second guessing myself, which I think that's always a good place to be. You want to be super skeptical, and for these testing to be, for the testing and training to be effective, it needs to be really good. If it's super obvious, it's kind of just a fake exercise. So I'm happy to see that they're doing well. If this is something you don't already have and you want to add, let us know. Basically what happens is we send out phishing tests to your staff, and depending on how they respond, if they click where they shouldn't have, if they forward it, reply to it, there's a whole level of different responses that they should or shouldn't do. If they do what they shouldn't do, they're enrolled in training that helps them understand for that specific instance why they did the wrong thing. It's honestly very helpful, and most cyber insurance providers require it. Engaging a spam filter to help limit spoofing and C-level, especially for the C-level, is really important. And then considering removing email addresses from your website. That just makes it really easy for people to understand the hierarchy of your business and then target attacks at you. That being said, in a world where LinkedIn exists, the risk is there kind of regardless. So a healthy level of skepticism is always required when it comes to email these days. Earlier we talked about the application installs for Microsoft 365 and Google. Your administrator should, if you are the administrator or if you have someone managing that for you, they should be able to disable that feature and make it require admin permission. Again, if you're a client of Firefly, we've already done that. We didn't talk about this in super specific detail, but one of the things that's been concerning lately is they call it credential cookie harvesting. I don't think that's the technical name, but it's effectively what it is. So once you get a two-factor authentication, there's a use of cookies and tokens that helps Microsoft know that the computer you're logged in, at least for now, is valid. If your computer were to be compromised, one of the methods that these bad actors have been using to get around this is they will take those files, put them on another machine, and they'll use that capability to bypass your multi-factor access. That's again why having a secure password is also important, not just the multi-factor. The ways to mitigate something like that, you got to make sure that your computers are clean. So making sure that you have, if you're on a personal computer, making sure at least you have the Windows Defender turned on, or that you have a third-party antivirus. That never hurts. If you're a client of Firefly, we have a number of tools that we employ to help make sure computers are clean on an ongoing basis. That's one of the best methods to protect against this is making sure that your computer doesn't have malware on it, because that's how they leverage this stuff. Another option is that physical security key I talked about. There's no reason those can't be used today. Most of the major services support them. You can buy the YubiKey, I think, on Amazon or from Google directly. But that's definitely something to consider. Depending on your licensing for service, there are things called conditional access policies that can be turned on. These allow you to set, so like if somebody tried to log in from Texas and then all of a sudden they try to log in from Romania, the Microsoft side of things will say, hey, they call it impossible travel. We're going to go ahead and just, based on nothing else, the fact that that's impossible, we're going to disallow that login and maybe even lock the account. So those are some options you have. It requires the more enterprise-grade licensing from Microsoft to do it, but it is definitely a good option. Having a plan, I think, for all of these issues, including the infrastructure attacks that I talked about, is really the most important part. If something happens, whether it be to your own business or to infrastructure at large, having a plan for how you'll handle that is one of the best ways to respond to it. And you really need to probably think outside the box a little bit. There's no software or other solution that's going to be foolproof. And in fact, some of the software that, as we install software, one of the things we have to continually think about is every single piece of software you install is itself a potential risk, because any piece of software loaded on a computer could itself be used as the method to infect it if they found, security holes in that software. So that's it's a very slippery slope. We try to choose wisely, but also not over provision or over utilize tools that we just don't need. So when we talk about having a written plan, especially on the business side, is something we would highly encourage. We're beginning to help people with this process. Several of our staff are going to be attending a webinar later this week that very specifically goes through how to really drive this home with your IT clients, and make sure that they have the plan that they need for their business. So it's something we're already helping with, but we're taking further steps on our end to try to really push those forward amongst our clients. Storing that plan somewhere that is not necessarily in your normal storage. You can always throw it in your cloud storage or whatever you're using, but having a printed copy offline somewhere is also important in case what happens is that you can't get to your storage anymore. So that's really important. Within such a plan, as we think about the infrastructure style attacks, it's kind of hard to know how far to go with some of these things, but one of the things I've been encouraging clients I've talked to is one of the things you might plan for is how you would communicate with your staff if the easy means are gone. So let's say your email access is unavailable for some period of time. Well, then of course, maybe you could resort to making sure you have a good staff list or some sort of calling tree that you could communicate to a large number of people if you have a large staff easily. Now, let's say the issue is that the cellular services are down. Well, I think at that point, a lot of people are going to start to focus inward in a world where we're having attacks on infrastructure like that. It may be that business is not the focus of people in that moment, but if you're a business that has maybe you yourself are critical infrastructure, or there's business services that you really, even in that scenario, would want to try to continue, having a plan on how you would survive that kind of outage as well is important. I know with my wife and I, whether it be an earthquake or some other natural disaster, or a cyber attack, having a plan on what you would do if all of a sudden you were unable to communicate and you're not in the same physical space, that's not out of the realm of something that should be planned for, I feel like, by everyone. My goal here today is not to just sit here and scare you, but in a world where you don't have a lot of control over what happens with some of these things, one of the things that you can control is how you would respond to them. And so even if it feels like a ridiculous exercise, really kind of playing some of these things out is never a bad idea. And that on a personal level comes all the way down to, I would treat the risks of a cyber attack much like I would treat the risks of a natural disaster. So if you're concerned about, there's CISA, the government organization that manages a lot of this stuff, they had a 60-minute episode last night, and they're specifically concerned about water treatment plants, amongst other things. So as you think through those things, I'm going to sound a little bit like a prepper, but having plans to address those things sort of on a personal level is important. I hope that we don't actually have to experience these things, but at the end of the day, you and I have very little control over what happens. And so I choose to then focus on controlling what I can, and that means preparing in every way that I can for some of these worst case scenarios. Balancing it with not going too far. I think that sometimes people do go a little bit overboard in these regards. So I think each person kind of knows what risk they can manage, but that's how I would approach it. Thinking about real life transactions and how multi-factor would kind of apply to them is something that I would encourage you to also think through. So what I mean by that is we should not trust a single phone call, a single text, or a single email to manage large financial transactions. And you have to determine for yourself what large is. On a personal basis, I'd probably say anything over $1,000. On a business, maybe more. But what we're recommending is that if someone's doing a wire transfer, for instance, probably setting up a Zoom call where you are on the phone with people, hopefully that you've met before so you recognize them, and you guys all together verify the details of the transaction before you send it. That is something I would do each and every time. Unless there's other security protocols that you have in place between, say, you and your bank. We have had some of our larger clients work with their banks to have basically, if they receive an email that's not specifically encrypted so that they know it came from the right place, they reject it. So there are ways to have secure communication, but most of us, especially on a personal level, aren't doing that. So if you do need to complete a financial transaction, take the time to verify it offline or in some other way. I think it's just it's too important, and it should only take 5 minutes if you plan for it properly. I already said this earlier, but a plan for communication if cellular or internet communications were to be interrupted is something we would highly recommend is in every plan. As part of that, let me make sure I don't talk about this on the next page. Yeah, let me stay here for a second. I would also recommend that you consider not leaving data in just one location, and that includes the cloud. This is a little bit new for us as well, but we are starting to suggest and sell Microsoft 365 backups. As we've moved people to services like we use a lot of Ignite for cloud storage, we've begun discussing how to back those up to other cloud services. The end goal is to not leave everything in one place. Now, if the entire internet's not available, you're going to really wish that you had a local copy of this data, and that is also possible in a lot of cases. So that's something we can discuss as well. But making sure that nothing exists in only one location, even if that's a cloud provider, it has become really important to think about. Having cyber insurance is less and less of an option, although it continues to get more and more expensive. If you don't already have it, it should be on your to-do list to at least talk to your insurance broker about. Normal policies very rarely include cyber coverage. Our coverage will not generally cover, or at least not fully cover, a cyber incident unless we are found to have sort of contributed to the failure. Ensuring that your policy covers your actual needs, risks, etc. is really important. And then the ongoing reapplication process to continue to get cyber insurance, it has become a really good check on the IT standing of a company. The insurance companies have obviously wised up to how big of a risk this is for them. And so as part of that, they're now having better and better questions in their review of the policies as to what's happening in the environment. And so we use those renewals as an opportunity to make sure that the products we're selling as part of our security package meet or exceed the requirements. And so that's something that if you're not using us, or you're handling this on your own, or use a different IT provider, whatever, making sure that you continue to comply and meet those guidelines on an ongoing basis is important. I have not heard of cyber insurance on a personal level. I just thought about that because one of my goals today was to bring most of this down to a personal level. I don't know if that exists. That's something I'd have to actually look into. And then talking to your team and your family, I think is if there's one thing that's important, it's this. All the tools in the world won't help if somebody basically leaves the door open. So if someone clicks on that phishing email and hands over their credentials and you don't have multi-factor, you're done. Like that, the door was left open and you're now dealing with an infiltration of some kind. Sometimes they're minor, sometimes they're major, but your team is the number one force that can help protect you. I guess the same would apply to your family. Helping to understand the inherent risks and consequences of an attack are always valuable. Helping your team or your family understand those risks is what I mean. Letting them know that this is the reason we're doing this phishing training is because if our email is inaccessible, or we have some sort of event where our data is taken and encrypted, that's going to cost all of us time, money, and it might eventually cost people their jobs if you don't have the ability to recover from it. Requesting and welcoming real-time feedback from everyone, encouraging people to ask questions when they're not sure about the legitimacy of something, basically building an environment where if I'm not certain, I feel very comfortable asking. That's the general goal. I know at Firefly, we don't mind if our clients forward us emails anytime that they're not sure about. And it's funny, now that we have a lot of phishing training, we'll get a lot of those emails forwarded to us and we'll ask people, they'll be like, is this legitimate? And we respond, it's not, but it's part of your phishing training. Good work. Thank you for being skeptical. So it's important to make sure that your team knows that's okay to do, whether it's internal, external, whatever. Continuing to educate in any way possible is always valuable. Every company is going to be different in regards to what could happen to you, or what you're looking for, or how you would address it. But making sure that you and your team, or you and your family, are all on the same page, that you guys understand the risks to the individual, to the company, and all of that is obviously very important. Reminding the people that work for you, or those that are in your family, that all of these risks apply to their personal data. That's never a bad reminder. Again, so often It used to be that we'd have companies say, well, I'm a small business. This doesn't really, I don't have to worry about this, do I? The answer is yes. And now it's become, it goes lower, like not just your business, but your personal. Educating your family and your friends, including your children, on cybersecurity, it's too important. If you've got a young child that's starting to, maybe they got their first email account or their first social networking account or whatever, taking the time to show them, hey, you need to use a password that's harder than that. Or showing them how to use a password manager, or making sure they know how to use multi-factor authentication. First, I guess, master these things yourself. Ask your IT company for help if you don't, but then help share that knowledge down the line with your friends, your family, your children, whatever the case may be. I can send this PDF, a PDF of this later, so you don't have to write these web addresses down, or you could just Google any of the titles and you'll get to these websites really quickly. But CISA is the government organization that manages a lot of the communication and response to these items. They have a new initiative called Shields Up. It's a play on, I believe, Star Trek. But it's meant to remind people of the risks that are facing them and how to mitigate those. They have a Cyber Essentials toolkit inside of that page that I looked through that I thought had a lot of good information. And then something that we are, at Firefly, we're looking at ways to help our clients traverse the process. But there's a framework from another government organization called NIST. They have what's called the Cyber Framework, and it's a framework of things it's basically a roadmap that you go through, and it helps you think about the risks to your company, how to address them, and if you follow the entire process, the end result is that you should be in as secure a place as you possibly can be. So that's something else that we're looking for ways to really specifically help our clients go through that framework, but we're happy to discuss it at any level today. That's most of what I had prepared for today. As you can tell, not a lot of it's the same as some of the security talks we've had in the past, but thinking about these things so that you can plan for them, address them, that was kind of the goal today. Understanding that it may not be your environment that gets hacked, but so much of infrastructure can impact your ability to do business. I think on the flip side, your ability to actually do something tangible to address it is limited. So again, thinking about, well, I can't control this. What am I going to do if it happens? So that's the high level overview. I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has them. I don't see any in the question and answer section yet, but if you do have them, just type them in there, and I'd be happy to address those. If not, we will send an email out with a link to this recording. Feel free to share it with anyone, and I'll also make sure that we include to everyone that attended today. I'll send the PDF of this presentation, so at least you have those links handy. If no one else has any questions, I'll give it just a couple more minutes, but I appreciate you attending today. If you have questions on an ongoing basis and you want us to talk more specifically about your business, obviously we welcome those conversations anytime. We find them to be both helpful and important. But that is all I have prepared. Still looking like no questions. I'm going to stop my screen share here so I can double check. Perfect. Let me see. I don't see anyone with their hand up. I don't see anyone asking questions. Perfect. Well, I'll go ahead and end the meeting for now. Thank you all for attending today. We'll probably be having more of these as time goes on. We want to make sure that we share all the information we have as soon as we can, and we appreciate your time. Thank you.